Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Well, of all the policy mistakes of this new government, it's hard to find a worse example of policy dysfunction, of policy on the run, and of a policy which will put ordinary Australians in danger of grave financial loss than the debacle which is this government's changes to financial advice. Now, these changes are the brainchild of the now departed Assistant Treasurer, the stood-aside Assistant Treasurer. He's responsible for their design and for their implementation. And there was a glimmer of hope last week when the Assistant Treasurer stood aside that maybe sanity would prevail. We thought maybe the new minister might come in, step in and undo the Assistant Treasurer's changes. But then yesterday we saw the financial review and it said the government was going to aggressively defend the financial advice changes. Cormann grabs his FOFA laws from fallen Sinodinos, and it gets better. There's a very large opinion piece on the inside back page defending the changes to financial advice. And I thought, oh well, they're off. They're still on there. This was yesterday. Yesterday. And it didn't last. That policy position, Mr Deputy Speaker, didn't last the day, because around 5 o'clock the Finance Minister announced he was freezing the changes. Freezing the changes. So what a difference a day makes, Mr Deputy Speaker. What a difference a day
The member
makes.
for Command will not use props. He knows it's disorderly, and I'll have to deal with him if he doesn't desist from using props.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Just assuring that the House is aware of Senator Cormann's statements, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I think we need to establish what actually went on yesterday, and I think we know what went on. The Minister for Finance slowly, during the course of the day, actually started to understand his own policy. He actually started to get what's going on, because he certainly didn't understand it in the morning. He certainly didn't know what his policy was in the morning, because he took to Twitter, the old Finance Minister, and he said, "Our FOFA reforms do not reintroduce commissions," he said. He said to me, "You should read my piece in the Australian Financial Review, and the decision to pause the regs was taken last Friday." Well, I'll deal with the last part first. It's a very strange media management strategy. If you take a decision on Friday to pause a government policy, to be out defending it on the front page of the Financial Review and writing op-eds in its defence on Monday. A very strange media strategy indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. But then, to the substance, he said, "Our FOFA reforms do not reintroduce commissions." That's pretty clear. So if you actually go to their policy, I would have thought pretty clear that commissions are reintroduced, but maybe I misunderstood. So we'll go to what other people think. What does Alan Kohler think? He says, "Minister, you are reintroducing sales commissions for general advice. The proposed amendment, the coalition policy, is perfectly clear on that score." And Mr Kohler is correct. And it's not just Mr Kohler who thinks this. The people who actually know something about financial planning, that would be the financial planners, they think commissions are being reintroduced under government policy, and they don't like it, Mr Deputy Speaker. They don't support the reintroduction of commissions. On the 19th of March, the chair of the Financial Planning Association put out a bulletin to his members, and he said, "There is one glaring change which has been heavily lobbied for that we cannot support, the so-called general advice exemption. The Financial Planning Association strongly opposes the payment of commissions under the general exemption. This is a retrograde policy that would allow remuneration by commission on the sale of investment and superannuation products to Australian consumers, and to open the door to a bygone era of mis-selling and inappropriate advice." So, rubbish, says the member for Ford. The financial planners don't know about financial planning, says the member for Ford. They don't understand what this policy does. The member for Ford should get his facts straight, as the Minister for Finance should. Very clearly this policy reintroduces commissions, and very clearly this is a retrograde step. And it's not just about general advice, it's also about personal advice, because their changes reintroduce commissions on personal advice. The Minister for Finance says, well, no, they can introduce bonuses if you happen to sell a lot of products, and that's not a commission. Apparently that's not a commission. Well, if it walks like a commission and talks like a commission, guess what, Deputy Speaker? It is a commission. And the Minister for Finance slowly worked this out during the course of yesterday. it slowly dawned on him what his policy actually was, and by 5 o'clock he decided that he could not proceed with this policy at this point. Now, this would be amusing if it wasn't so serious, Mr Deputy Speaker, but there's a lot at stake here. There is a lot at stake. These reforms were introduced in response to a catastrophe for Australia's investors, a catastrophe for normal investors who were following the advice of financial planners. And tomorrow, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the 5th anniversary of the collapse of Storm Financial. Yeah. Now, what an arrogant sense of irony it takes for this government to rip up changes to financial laws to provide protection to ordinary investors right across the country on the 5th anniversary of the collapse of Storm Financial. And it's not just Storm Financial that led the previous government to make these changes. There was Trio. The member for Cunningham and the member for Throsby remember in particular the damage to their communities caused by the collapse of Trio. And there was, and which the Minister for Finance indicated before the election he would consider compensation for those people, and in fact they are going the other way, as the member for Cunningham correctly points out. And we had Westpoint, based in Western Australia, in which 4,300 investors, primarily Western Australians, lost $310 million in that collapse. $310 million. And why were they investing, by and large, in Westpoint? Because their financial advisors told them it was a good investment, advised them to invest in Westpoint. Now, why would anybody advise that an investment in what was in effect a Ponzi scheme was a good idea? Well, the commissions being paid for the advice, to invest in Westpoint amounted, on average, to 10% of the amount invested. And this government thinks that's just fine. This government wants to bring back laws which will enable that to happen, and that is a disgrace, Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, that is nothing short of a disgrace. And in the Westpoint case, we saw ASIC conclude that advisers had, and I quote, negligently advised members to invest in certain Westpoint products and engaged in misleading and deceptive conduct. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, the vast majority of Australia's financial planners are very professional people who give very good advice. But Australian consumers deserve protection from those who are not. Now, the Prime Minister says, this is his response. He says, and I quote, "It is a given of ethical practice that if you are a professional, then you are taking the best interests of your client, your patient, your customer into account, and regulatory burdens around what are ethical givens are, I think, a classic case of regulatory overkill." That was the Prime Minister on the 17th of March. Well, the Prime Minister should face the victims of Trio and the victims of Westpoint and the victims of Storm and tell them that this is regulatory overreach. Tell them, Mr Deputy Speaker, that these reforms go too far, because they know more than anybody else why these reforms were introduced, and they know why this government is wrong. And when you've got a government which has got it so wrong that the Financial Planning Association says they've gone too far, that Choice says they've gone too far, that National Seniors says they've gone too far, then they know they've got a problem. You've got Choice, who said it's important to remember that the need for widespread reform followed the catastrophic effects of major financial advice scandals. These are the problems that FOFA was designed to fix, and we urge the government to reconsider its changes. And you've got Michael O'Neill, the National Seniors CEO, who said, if cutting red tape means creating a murky environment in which hard-earned savings of hard-working Australians end up in the hands of financial advisers, you can leave it. That's Seniors Australia, Mr Deputy Speaker. So people are on to this government. And what's particularly galling about this government's approach here is the dodgy and sneaky way they've gone about this. There's a way you can change the law in Australia. It's called the parliament. You introduce legislation. You go through a parliamentary process. You put it before a committee. What did the former Assistant Treasurer seek to do? Introduce these changes by regulation. And what's worse, he was proposing to introduce the regulation on Thursday afternoon when the House had risen, and the parliament could not disallow it for 6 weeks. What a dodgy and sneaky way to go about the administration of this nation. And it is just as well that the Minister for Finance has stepped back and paused these reforms. But I say this, the Minister for Finance thinks that he can get away with putting these reforms off until after April the 5th, and can continue the dodgy and sneaky approach and mislead the people of Western
Order.
Australia.
The honourable
He is
member's
wrong.
time has